the identity of the city of Denham Springs. It's the way we present ourselves and the way we are perceived as a community at large. The three questions that I want to focus on are how do we present ourselves, how are we perceived, and what is our community's identity? Or if you want to think of it kind of in a marketing sense, you can kind of say what you can kind of define what would our brand be, what would be our tagline, and what is our hook. I'm curious to know if anybody can think of anything at all, because I personally can't. I can think of different aspects of our identity, but I can't think of anything that comes together as a holistic identity. I can think of our history. I can think of the Amite River, people moving next to the springs. A resort is built, some families get married. The name Denham Springs comes into existence. The railroad comes through. There's logging. The city's incorporated in 1903. There's an ore factory somewhere in the mix. Interstate 12 is built, and then of course we had the Great Flood just last year. I can think of our economic identity, keep our tax dollars in the city. I can think of our demographic identity. We're the largest city in one of the fastest growing parishes in the state. I can think of all of our institutions, all of our churches. I can think of our neighborhoods and our infrastructure, but I can't put my finger on anything in particular that I would count as Denham Springs' holistic identity. And to give you guys an idea of what I'm talking about when I say identity, all you have to do is kind of look around the state and you can kind of see some other examples. There are some that are pretty big and obvious. Right next door to us we have Baton Rouge, the Red Stick, capital city. New Orleans is an easy one. It's the Big Easy with Laissez-les Bon Temps Roulette. There are some cities that have a great air of romanticism invested in their identity. Slidell is the Camellia City. St. Martinville is the birthplace of Acadiana. There are tons of world capitals throughout Louisiana. Ponchatoula is the strawberry capital of the world. Breaux Bridge, the crawfish capital of the world. Gonzales is the jambalaya capital of the world. Rain is the frog capital of the world, which is super weird, but can make it work. And even our beautiful neighbor, Walker, bills itself as the pine tree capital of the world. Those are all awesome examples of cities that own their identity and present themselves into the world in a way that is memorable, and it gives you insight into who their people are and what they're all about. So, where does that leave Denham Springs? What's our tagline? How are we presented and perceived? The only thing I can think of is Dinky Springs, which I think all of us would say is pretty inaccurate. I've lived here my entire life. I've gone to school here. I've opened a business here, purchased my home here. And I'm actually the 5th generation of my family to call Denham Springs home. But even with all that Denham Springs credibility, I can't put my finger on any one thing that is our cohesive cultural identity. I think the bottom line is that we just don't have one. We just don't have a cohesive cultural identity as a city. That begs the question, how come? I think that somewhere along the way, the process got hijacked. And I think I actually know when. I think in the 70s when the interstate came through and brought with it so much traffic, that traffic brought with it a need to define and describe new places. Denham Springs was just like a lot of other cities around the country that got transformed, with a small city being transformed by the interstate sprawl. And I think that's when, during that transformation and labeling, that Denham's proximity to Baton Rouge was the first idea of note, and it kind of stuck. I think it was around that time we were kind of saddled with a bit of a pseudo-identity. And I call it a pseudo-identity because it's not place-specific, so it can't be our specific identity. There are lots of other communities that are described in this way. It's actually more of a label. And the label that gets thrown around everywhere you see is that of a bedroom community. There are a few prominent examples. This is the Livingston Economic Development Council's website. Their description of the city of Denham Springs. Denham Springs boasts the best of a bedroom community, small town charm with a big city convenience. Livingston Parish Council, where Denham Springs residents are offered the harbor of a bedroom community. And this is an example of the national media attention that we received after the flood. And this Wall Street Journal article is kind of indicative of the way that a lot of news media outlets across the country wrote about us. Everyone from Fox News, CNN, Chicago Tribune, tons of other daily papers. They say, 1 month after the flooding devastated this bedroom community of roughly 10,000 people outside of Baton Rouge, yada, 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 and then it gets into it. Also, if you've ever been anywhere online, if you're buying or selling any real estate, or if you're traveling anywhere, or if you're looking at some of our local media, especially some of the more Baton Rouge-centric ones, you can't help but to absolutely trip over all the times Denham Springs is described simply as a bedroom community. So, excuse me, bedroom community. It's both what we're putting down and what everybody else is picking back up. It sounds fine. I mean, bedroom community, it sounds actually kind of warm and cuddly when you say it out loud. But in reality, I think it's probably actually a pretty big mistake, and overall just a very low bar to set for ourselves. First, what bedroom community technically means is a commuter city where the residents have to commute for either work or to be in touch with different amenities. But on top of that definition, there are actually a lot of different inferences that can be made. Automatically, it implies that we're not self-sufficient, which in turn implies that we're dependent on another city. In some ways, it's true. In some ways, it's true in that all cities, to some extent, are interdependent on each other. But the label presents itself as sort of a one-way street that's not so easily reciprocated. This label also fails to define us on our own merits, and instead assigns our value as dependent on that of our larger neighbor. It overlooks every aspect of who we are and what we're capable of. This label discourages community engagement. It implies that all you ever need is just a car ride away, which makes maintaining an active citizenry a difficult proposition if they are spending much of their time somewhere else or in traffic. This label discourages strong community bonds. It presents us as a home base, but not as a home for opportunities. The very nature of the term gives us all an exit strategy to seek engagement and fulfillment somewhere else instead of cultivating it here at home. To further illustrate these points, I'll kind of give you an example. I'll introduce all you guys to my wife, Michelle. She's the cute chick in the back with the top knot. I'll introduce her in two ways, and we'll see how it plays out and see what works and what doesn't. So this is my wife, Michelle Cavalier. She is unbelievably beautiful, kind, and funny. She has an amazing talent for organization and analytical thinking. She takes care of me. She gives amazing scalp massages. And she always worries about me if I drink too much caffeine. She often eats popcorn and Raisinets for dinner. And she wishes that she were a robot so that she didn't have to get haircuts. Michelle is undoubtedly my favorite person on planet Earth, and I love her with my entire heart. So that's my wife, that's Michelle. That's her on her own terms. It's her defined as her own person. It's a slice of her, and it gives you context and insight into who she actually is. And so now, pretend you've never met her. I'll introduce her again, this way in the style of the community bedroom label. This is my wife, Michelle. She's Jenny and JD's sister. End of introduction. It doesn't work so well. Apart from the introduction having the potential to cause marital problems, it gives you zero info as to who Michelle actually is, and it defines her only in the context of others, and doesn't promote any sort of engagement with her. Although it does make you super curious to know who JD and Jenny are. In short, the quick second-hand introduction would be demoralizing for Michelle, just as the bedroom community label is disheartening for our community. And our community has been described this way for decades. And to what end? Why have we not bothered to update our narrative or to claim our identity? I think that's another talk for another day. I think we could probably spend a couple more of these TED Talks discussing that, but it's a little bit of what I hope that we'll take away to discuss and kind of expound upon more so we can figure the whole thing out. But if you cut to the present, I don't think it can be denied that we have a city that can provide for our basic necessities, but we can't provide for ourselves intellectually, creatively, or culturally. And in that respect, we are still a bedroom community. And so where does that leave us? I have absolutely no idea where that leaves us. But I believe the label is holding us back. It prevents us from fully engaging with our city, and it gives us only the most basic community bond. If we could all just agree to be a little more creative in describing ourselves and abandon this old label, and if we each try to think about what we have to offer to our flood recovery efforts and then volunteer them up, and if we realize that our lives have been established in ways that support other people's communities instead of our own, I think then we can start to talk about our own citywide identity and start shaping it and forming it. And I think then we can figure out what we're the world capital of, and we can be thought of as more than just another interstate exit on the way to somewhere else. Thank you very much.